everybody. I think we're good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday to you. Thank you for joining in if you're with us today on the Friday edition of Walking Through History, the story of God's people and his creation as his of Genesis. We are working our way through the text. We're in the latter portion of Genesis, in the final 10 or so chapters, as we are picking up in 40 this afternoon. We looked on Friday at chapter 39. We the entire time looking at chapter 39, dealing with Joseph and the issues that he had in Potiphar's house. Not anything of Potiphar's doing. Potiphar looked at Joseph very favorably, really respected Joseph for who he was, and especially the fact that it was very obvious to him that God was blessing Joseph. And of course, if God was blessing Joseph, that meant in an indirect way, God was blessing Potiphar in his house. So Potiphar was very pleased with him. But unfortunately, Mrs. Potiphar was a woman of loose actions, we'll say. She tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph would have none of it. And Potiphar had to do what he had to do in putting him in prison. But thankfully, because of his favorable outlook on Joseph, he puts him in as good of a place as you can be, which was the king's prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So it was not the dungeon below the dungeon. It was still a prison, mind you, but it was a situation where it could have been much worse than it was. We see the end of chapter 39 and verse 21 that the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden, and the warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. He was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. So in many respects, Joseph's situation wasn't awful, but he's still in prison. And you would think, as we're working our way through this story, that Joseph would quickly find himself out of prison. And yet what we're going to see, Alan, in chapter 40 is that isn't the case. Really what we're going to see is in chapter 40 ends very similar to the end of chapter 39. But once we get to 41, we'll see Joseph making a very strong rise from this position that we find himself in at the end of chapter 39. I've been speaking to Alan. Alan, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here this afternoon. And yes, we are glad that you had a haircut. You definitely... We ran into Alan, my wife and I, the other day at the grocery store as he's out getting some things, and tell you, Alan's beard looks good online, but in person, it just makes me even more jealous than it does as we're doing these Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I tried to shave it off the other day, but Melanie said no. So, she's in charge of all that. So, gotta listen to her.
I would say that, whenever you have a pregnant wife, it is that time that where it's very appropriate to grow out the facial hair. Maybe a little more than you're used to, and especially whenever Lincoln comes in the world, he needs to see the very first look of his papa needs to be that strong, manly man with the good beard. All right, Alan, good to see you, and thank you for everyone who is joining in. We have some who have mentioned on Facebook that you're joining with us. Thank you for being here. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask. You are more than welcome to interact with us and participate with us in the comment section. We would love to have any questions or comments that you might like to share with us. Alan, let's get into the text. We are in Genesis chapter 40. We are going to be reading a few verses here to set the scene for what's going on with Joseph. Even though he is in prison, he has an opportunity here to do some good. We're in Genesis chapter 40, beginning verse 1. I have it on the screen if you don't have a Bible in front of you. So please feel free to follow along with us here. Actually, I do not have it on the screen. I actually need to share that, don't I? Here we go. Now we're on the screen. Now we should be on the screen. There we go. All right. We are in Genesis chapter 40. There we go. Beginning in verse 1. After this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant and they were in custody for some time. The king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We had dreams," they said, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So, Alan, as we get into chapter 41, we have an occurrence that we've already seen within the life of Joseph come into play once again, and it is the occurrence of dreams. If we go back to Joseph's real introduction into the narrative in chapter 37, there are dreams present, but as opposed to these dreams, Alan, those dreams were of Joseph. Those were Joseph's dreams in chapter 37. But here in chapter 40, we see a switch in the way that Joseph interacts with dreams. No longer are they his dreams, which, mind you, got him into trouble, but now these are dreams of someone else. But yeah, I believe verse 8 is key, Alan. Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell us a little something about Joseph and seeing his progression in who he is and this talent that he has in interpreting dreams.
This is definitely a little bit different from the earlier ones, because in the earlier ones, God's not even mentioned. He just has these dreams, and it seems like he just tells everyone what about those dreams. And those dreams are a little bit different because they were not difficult to interpret. These that the baker and the cupbearer have, those are going to be a little bit trickier to interpret, and Joseph attributes that interpretation to God. Those other ones, everyone knew exactly what those dreams meant. So there wasn't any skill or anything on Joseph's part, that he was just the one that happened to have the dreams. And then, of course, if you remember, he's constantly talking about them. Seems like he probably a little bit too much, to the point that his brothers were, hated him because of that. So it is interesting here that at this point, again, this is another low point in Joseph's life. He kind of seemed to be coming out of the pit there with Potiphar and in his house, and then all of a sudden, bam, he's thrown back into prison. And I think it mentions he's pretty much the personal attendant in verse 4 of these men. So, it could be worse, but he's also a prisoner, and he's also serving other prisoners. So it could be a lot better at this point. Yet he still has not forgotten about God. He didn't forget about it when he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, and now with these dreams, he's not gonna. I mean, they don't know anything about God. They would have just assumed he just had this great skill as a dream interpreter. But Joseph doesn't take that credit. He makes sure they first understand that interpretations belong to God here.
Right, and something else, just to kind of notice in passing, the fact that Joseph, though he is in a position that he's later on, just a little later on here in verse 15, he speaks about having done nothing wrong that should have put me in prison. Even though Joseph is in a position that he does not deserve to be in, I take it as some showing of his character that he was even just paying attention to these individuals. They were put in his care, and he could have had the attitude, well, I shouldn't be here anyways, so I'm not going to pay attention to anybody else. I've been done wrong, so I'm not going to do right by anyone else. But yet he noticed their sadness. And I think, just again, in passing, not putting too much into this, that just shows something about his character. He truly did care about others, and he was going to put his best foot forward, even in a situation that he did not deserve to be in. That, to me, is character and shows the integrity that he possessed. But verse number 9, after he says, the interpretations, they belong to God, he actually poses it as a question, because they've had these dreams. There's no one there to interpret them, verse 8. And he says, don't interpretations belong to God? This is an affirmative question. It is a question, yes, but it is a statement at the same time that these things belong to God. Tell me your dreams. And he believes that God is with him, as we've seen. If we go to the beginning of chapter 39, in verse number 2 and 3, in verse number 5 and 6. It is apparent that the Lord is with him at the end of chapter 39, beginning verse 21 and going through the end of the chapter. It is apparent that God is with him. It's apparent to us in the text. It also seems to be apparent to Joseph in his life in that moment that God was with him. So he believes, if you tell me the dreams, then I have confidence that God can give you an interpretation through me. So the chief cupbearer, verse number 9, told his dream to Joseph. In my dream, there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hands. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. That's the dream. Here's the interpretation. Joseph says the 3 branches are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand the way you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well for you, here's the request. Here is him, being kind, but here's a request that he has for the cupbearer in this moment as he's going through this difficulty. He says, but when all this goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by making me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. And when the chief baker, verse 16, saw that the interpretation was positive, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is its interpretation, Joseph replied, verse 18. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and in just 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh from your body. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the Pharaoh hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had explained to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Alan, in these dreams, there is a particular number that shows up time and time again. What is that particular number, and how does it play into the interpretation of these dreams?
If you'll notice, in each set of dreams, we have 3 different dream sequences. So the first one was Joseph's dream back in chapter 37, and there were 2 dreams that were basically almost the same. And it was the doubling of that dream that, you have one dream, it could mean anything, but to have the same type of dream twice is clearly not an accident. So that's why the doubling would have, I guess, made sure that they understood that this is for real. Same thing here. We have 2 dreams this time, but they use each dream has a lot of 3s involved. So the cupbearer's dream, let's see, there were 3 branches, and then if you notice, there's groups of 3 different actions. So in verse 10, on the vine were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and its clusters ripened. So there's another group of 3. And then in verse 11, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. So again, just these clusters of 3s consistently, and Joseph hits on that. It's all of these repetitive 3s that highlight that's an important part of it. And he notices that the 3 branches and all the other 3s confirming it are referring to 3 days. And that's exactly what happens. In 3 days from the time of this dream, both of these dreams are fulfilled. And the chief baker was the same. He had 3 baskets. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods. And it's interesting that these are together because they are similar. So this is to me, it's a little sick, it's a little dark, but it's one of the funniest passages in the Bible to me, because the baker, what is he thinking? He's thinking, oh, that was a really, if that's true, man, that's awesome. You know, the cupbearer's back. He's in Pharaoh's good graces again. I mean, that sounds great. And the baker's also thinking, man, I had kind of the same dream. There's a lot of threes involved. You know, he's smart enough. He's not just a cook. I mean, I think these are officials and confidants of Pharaoh. So these are smart guys. So he recognizes, like, hey, I have kind of the same dream. And it starts off the same way in verse 18. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Okay, great. Something's going to happen in 3 days. In 3 days, verse 19, Pharaoh will lift up your head. Oh, just like he's going to lift up the cupbearer's head as well. And this is the part that I can't help but laugh in my dark sense of humor. From off of you. It's just so funny. Like, and it's so sad too, because you can just see the baker's countenance, just like, oh, great, it's the same. Oh no, it is not the same. And he's going to get hung on the tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from your body. So I'm sorry for laughing, but this is one of those times I think maybe the writer's having a little bit of fun here. God's got a little bit of sense of humor for us people with a dark sense of humor.
Yeah, we can't ignore the literary humor in this. The fact that these 2 men who you mentioned, these were not just any old cupbearer, or I guess the position cupbearer is never just any old cupbearer, but it's not just any old baker. This is the cupbearer who was in charge of providing drink for Pharaoh, the one who made sure where the drink came from, that it was safe to give to Pharaoh, a person of importance. And also the baker, the one who provided the bread for Pharaoh, which was the staple of a diet at that time, even in our day as well. These 2 staples, these 2 incredibly important positions within the court of Pharaoh, they have these dreams, and looking at these dreams, as you mentioned, and as we're going to see in chapter 41, Joseph in chapter 41 is going to identify God as being the one who's given these dreams. And though he does not identify God as having given these dreams here, I have confidence in saying that these were divinely given dreams, that they were given by God for the purpose of continuing on this story, Joseph's time in Egypt, of figuring out, well, how does he go from prison at the end of chapter 39? How can he get from there to some place where he can actually help his family in some way? And as we're looking at the story in chapter 40, we're seeing how that's going to happen, because he gives this interpretation. You mentioned the repetition of 3, which to me, looking at the fact that in verse 20, that on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, I would have to say they knew Pharaoh's birthday was coming up. So for Joseph here, he's seeing everything that's going on, the 3 days, and then in 3 days is going to be Pharaoh's birthday. It's like, okay, this is all making sense now. That Joseph then gives this interpretation, and he puts in verse number 14, remember that I was with you. So there's a plea here that whenever you were restored, remember me and bring me up. So somebody reading this for the first time is thinking, all right, here it is. This is how Joseph's going to rise up out of this position of being imprisoned. And yet, as we get to verse number 23, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. He forgot Joseph. So there's a couple of foreshadowings here. Number one, in verse 14, there's this foreshadowing of Israel's redemption from Egypt. Joseph says, remember me as you are exalted. Well, what's going to happen later on once Israel is in Egypt? Well, they're going to be remembered by God, and they're going to be exalted and delivered from Egypt. Also, though, verse 23, he did not remember him. Well, that's telling us a little bit about the foreshadowing of Israel too, that they were going to endure future ill treatments in Egypt. So we see those foreshadowings here within the text, and we see, as you mentioned, kind of a little bit of the dark humor in this, that the baker is all excited hearing a good interpretation, and ends up being that there's no good interpretation for him, and he ends up losing his life. Whatever it was that they did to offend their master, we are not told. But for one, he was restored. The cupbearer was restored. For the other, though, that was the end of his time in this life. I want to notice, Alan, as we did at the beginning, at the end of chapter 20, or excuse me, at the end of chapter 39, Joseph's in prison. At the end of chapter 40, we've gone through an entire chapter of this story, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him, which insinuates to us that he is still in prison. So where do we go from here? Get into chapter 40 at the end of 2 years. Now Pharaoh had a dream. And in his dream, he was standing beside the Nile. And when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. And the sickly thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. When morning came, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them. Alan, as you mentioned, from the dreams that we find in chapter 40, here again is a set of 2 dreams. These 2 dreams involve cows and grain. Is there any significance, you think, Alan, in these 2 dreams, again, happening on the same night and also involving cows and grain?
These 2 things would definitely be very symbolic for Pharaoh. Egypt at this time would have been known. I mean, they're known even later on in history for being a breadbasket for specifically the Roman Empire. It was said that Egypt was the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. That's where they got all of their grain from. And at this time, they would have been known for having a lot of cattle as well. And this wouldn't have been strange for them to see these cows probably wading down into the marshes and the weeds of the Nile to cool off, find some food, get some water, and then coming back out. We might think that's a strange scene, but for the Egyptians, that would have been completely normal. But if you'll notice that Pharaoh is troubled after these dreams, and for good reason. It's tough for us because we know the interpretations already, having studied it so many times. But I wonder, this is another one of those times you might not know exactly what it means, but it's definitely foreboding. These healthy cows getting devoured by these unhealthy cows, and the plump good grain getting scorched, and these thin grains emerging, and not looking. Think about it. There's no evidence that those first groups have ever existed. There's no reminder that there were 7 plump cows or these 7 ears of grain. So you can kind of understand why Pharaoh's a little troubled. We've already talked about just the doubling aspect of it. That's, you have one dream, you just dismiss it, but 2 dreams that are so obviously connected that for someone like Pharaoh that would have put stock in dreams, we don't think about dreams anymore. We just think they're fun, and we talk about them, and we don't put any extra interpretation to them now. But back then, and if a Pharaoh who is considered a god on earth, if he's getting a dream, then typically that means it's some sort of message from the gods or something. So he kind of knows that there's something going on. This is very troubling, and it's very concerning for him that he can't find someone to interpret it for him. All these magicians, there's no one that can do that for him. So this is pretty. I can understand why Pharaoh's having trouble sleeping at this point.
Later on the text, Alan, in verse 25, Joseph tells Pharaoh, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. I read a comment from one person who, looking at verse number 8, when morning came, he was troubled, so he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. And it probably wasn't that they couldn't interpret it. They probably were giving some sort of interpretation, but it simply was not satisfactory. That they were not interpretations that made him feel any less of the anxiety that I agree you're rightly attributing to him during this. The fact that here are good things, good, plump, strong cattle, which represented prosperity in the lands. And then here is good, plump, strong grain, which represented the main food source of the land. And yet in both of these instances, they're both swallowed up by nothing, by weak cows and weak grain. That can't be that can't represent anything good. And no one in his land could interpret them. But the comment I saw was something to this effect, that pagans could not interpret a message from God. And that's what we have here. That we have here a message from God, as Joseph identifies in verse 25. And those who did not belong to God, those who did not seek God, they would not have the ability to interpret what it was that God was trying to get across. And of course, what we're understanding in all this is God's providence. This is God working to bring along his people to where they need to be. And we know, and those of us who have read this story before and know how this story develops, that it is through them coming down, through Joseph's family eventually coming down into Egypt, that they're able to prosper, and that they are able to multiply and to grow into a great nation. And then it is at that point, it's almost like they're in a kind of an incubator down in Egypt. And once the incubation period is over, that God is going to bring them up out of Egypt and take them into the promised land. So we have here then God working in this way to provide dreams. The people of Pharaoh, the wise men and the magicians, they couldn't figure it out in a satisfactory way for Pharaoh. And then, hold on a second, verse number 9. Man, I wish I could snap. I can't do it. Verse number 9, the chief cupbearer, this man who we see at the end of chapter 40, who did not remember Joseph. Maybe he was keeping that one in his back pocket for a time. We're not certain. But this is what he says in verse number 9. Today, I remember my faults. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. So he's going back to chapter 40, what's already taken place. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning, which is different than we're going to see in these dreams. Those dreams, two separate dreams happening on the same night, they had different meanings. What we're going to see from Pharaoh's dreams, two dreams, same night, similar meanings. He said, verse 11, that he and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was with us there. We told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and I want us to note this. They quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. We're looking in this story, looking for this next exaltation of Joseph, because that's what we've seen all throughout Joseph's life at this point, is him being elevated to a high position. Amongst his brothers, he was the favorite. But what happens? His brothers take him and downgrade him to the pits. Well, then he's raised up out of the pits, brought down into Egypt, and he is elevated and exalted to a great position within Pharaoh's house. Yet, because of what happened with Mrs. Potiphar, Potiphar's house, yet with what happened with Mrs. Potiphar, he then is downgraded again to the dungeon. We see an instance where he might be helped. That doesn't happen. But now at this time, we see him again being elevated and exalted to this new position before Pharaoh. And I want us to note the changing of his clothes. That's something that we've seen again throughout the story. The robe is something that we see with his brothers. The clothes and the robe being used as the sign that he's been killed. Him leaving his clothes with Mrs. Potiphar and her using them as a sign of some sort of indiscretion. These themes, Alan, continue to show themselves time and time again. What do you make anything though, Alan, of the way that the cupbearer at this time kind of describes Joseph, and the fact that he doesn't mention Joseph at all until this seemingly opportune time?
I can understand why he wouldn't mention Joseph. I mean, for 2 years now, he's got no reason to, except just to be kind or nice. But I mean, think about it. The cupbearer's just spent some time in prison. So why would he start to ask Pharaoh for favors or start to be asking people for favors? He's probably just trying to lay low and, stay out of trouble and not get thrown into prison again. So I can definitely understand why he hasn't up until this point. It's kind of funny, verse 9, today I remember my faults. I don't think he's forgotten about Joseph in that sense, that he just like, oh yeah, I just remembered. But he finally sees this as a perfect opportunity to, of course, he, like you said, he's been keeping that in his back pocket as need be. Well, clearly, no one can interpret the dreams, and he knows someone that can and did. So, I mean, if it works out, great. Then he's the cupbearer that brought Joseph to him. If not, then no big deal. He's just trying to help. The other guys couldn't do it. His guy couldn't do it either. They're still in the same boat. So this is a low risk play for the chief cupbearer, but high reward, I think. I find it interesting thinking back to the cupbearer and the baker. It's interesting that it's the baker that's the one that is executed, because that opens up a position for which I think is the one that Joseph fills. I mean, think about it. He's the one in charge of gathering all of the grain. That's really, we think of baker, we think of just the guy that's making the food for Pharaoh. I don't think that's what his role was. I think he was the one in charge of all the grain in the nation, and that's pretty much the role that Joseph will take. And kind of interesting too, he's going to surpass the cupbearer, because he's going to be number 2 behind Pharaoh. I don't know at what level the cupbearer was, but he's definitely lower than Joseph after this happens.
Right, the cupbearer double dips into Joseph and takes advantage of him a couple of times now here within this text, and he brings to mind this young Hebrew slave Joseph. He says, all right, he did this for me. Maybe I can gain even more favor in Pharaoh's eyes by bringing this man to him. And if it works out, great. I've gained even more favor in Pharaoh's eyes. So he brings him, then verse 15. Joseph is brought to Pharaoh again, shaved, changed his clothes. And that kind of happens, as I mentioned, throughout the story. Every time there's either a downgrading of his position or an upgrading of his position, it has something to do with clothes at the same time. So verse 15, he stands before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to Joseph, I have had a dream. No one can interpret it, but I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. Verse 16, I am not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile and grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, weak, very sickly, and thin, came up. I've never seen such sickly ones as these in all the land of Egypt. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. When they had devoured them, you could not even tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 good ones. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads are 7 years. The dream The 7 thin sickly cows came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless scorched heads of grain are 7 years of famine. It is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. Alan, much like the two dreams that we found in chapter 40, where the number there that's repeated time and time again is 3, we find another number here in these dreams repeated. What number would that be, and what significance does it have?
Just like with the cupbearer and the baker's dreams, the three meant 3 days. Well, here we have a number 7 that represents the 7 years. I find it interesting in this chapter. We actually see the dreams told twice, which seems kind of extra. Like, why do you need to repeat the dream again? I mean, obviously he would have repeated it to Joseph because Joseph hadn't heard it yet. But in a narrative sense, why does it need to be listed again? So that usually, when something's said twice, or a story is mentioned 2 different times, you usually want to highlight the differences. And you'll notice the difference this time, that when Pharaoh is telling Joseph, the only differences are usually some of the adjectives that he uses to describe the 7 bad, either the cows, or the sickly cows, or the withered grain. He usually adds more of those adjectives in, either sickly or withered, poor. Some of these words are added in compared to the first telling. So you can tell what is on Pharaoh's mind. He's not looking at the first 7s and thinking, oh, great, 7 fat cows, that sounds good. What he's really worried about, and that's why he's having trouble sleeping, and he's really, he's wondering about these dreams, is he's worried about these 7 ugly looking things and what those mean, because that doesn't sound good. 7 thin, ugly cows that eat the good ones, that clearly is the focal point of the dream, and it's not a good dream. So you understand why it would have been tough too for the magicians and all the dream interpreters. They would not want to give a negative interpretation, whether it's true or not. They want to give good news to Pharaoh. He's clearly, we don't know Pharaoh's personality, but he's thrown his cupbearer and baker into prison for something, who knows what, and then elevates them a few days later. So he might be a little on edge to them or something. I don't know. That's just kind of guessing. But they would not really want to give a negative or a bad interpretation, which really highlights Joseph, because he tells them the truth, even though the truth is it's somewhat negative. Yeah, there's going to be 7 good years, but there's going to be 7 bad years. He's not afraid to tell them the truth. He's not trying to tiptoe around and make it seem as good as possible. And of course, he's Joseph at this point. He acknowledges that this is not nothing I'm doing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Joseph's just the messenger. He's just telling them what's true, and take it or leave it here.
Right, but it isn't just that he is interpreting the dream and being very upfront and honest about it. The reality is that hearing that there's a 7-year famine coming is probably disconcerting to Pharaoh. This is not something that's going to fill him with warm and fuzzies. This is going to be something that is very troubling to him. But instead of just giving him the interpretation of the dream, I really want to point out what we see beginning verse 33, that Joseph goes beyond interpretation. Now he goes into advice giving. Verse 33, so now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming under Pharaoh's authority. Store the grain in the city so they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. Joseph says, hey, if that's what's coming, and if we know there's going to be years of great abundance before the famine, then why not take advantage of that abundance? If we think just in Old Testament terms about what was to be given to God or anything like that, we think of a tenth. But here, that's doubled. Well, we don't even just take a tenth of what we have. We need to take a fifth of what we have, Alan, and store it back. Now, what we're going to see, and I really like this verse 30. Let's read verse 37 first, and then maybe we'll come back to, I don't know, maybe a little bit of speculation about what Joseph's thinking and all this was. But verse 37 says, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants, and he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's spirit in him? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only I as king will be greater than you. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, see, I am placing you over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in the second chariot, and servants called out before him, make way. So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt without your permission. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zephanath-Paneah and gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest at On. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. So I wonder, Alan, as Joseph is given this proposal of what you need to do you think he, in his mind, was setting himself up to take this position? I really don't know. I'm curious about that. What are your thoughts?
I can't imagine. I mean, even if Joseph had some idea of thinking, okay, this is probably going to be my chance to get out of the pit, out of prison. So he's happy about that. I can't imagine, even in his wildest dreams, he thought he'd be number 2 to Pharaoh. I mean, remember, they've already mentioned a couple times, like, by the way, this is a Hebrew. This isn't even an Egyptian. They've had to shave him and all that. So none of that would have been forgotten about. And it's not like the Egyptians just loved foreigners or anything. And so that would have been a trouble in and of itself, just to have a Hebrew, even in a position in court, I would think. So for Joseph to think that he is going to be that man in charge of in such a high position of honor, I'd be surprised if that was the case. I think at the very least, he's offering his advice, which is bold in and of itself, and I think part of it, he's genuinely, wanting to take care, help the people understand that this is serious, and this needs to be done, because he knows that there's going to be a lot of death involved if that doesn't happen. Maybe he even is thinking about his family back home in some way. I don't know, but I'd be surprised. At the very least, I think he's thinking he'll at least get out of the prison and maybe at least be given some sort of money or a minor position, but I can't imagine he thought he'd be number 2 and rise to such a great position like he has. And I just want to highlight on the flip side, notice that Pharaoh in verse 38 and 39, twice he's mentioning not just how awesome Joseph is, but why Joseph is the right person. It's because of God. And that's surprising to me, because I mean, Pharaoh would have no knowledge of Yahweh God in any way. So he would have considered himself one of the gods anyway, himself. So it's interesting. We've talked about these types of characters that they're not Hebrews, they're not part of the family of Abraham, but they so recognize God's presence in a person that they want to associate with them. And I think this Pharaoh right here is, we'll see later on, is just, pretty not righteous, but pretty remarkable and good character, which is perfect for Joseph and for his family, and that's why they're in such a good position throughout the end of the book.
I'm thinking, Alan, in regards to Pharaoh's recognition that God was with Joseph. I mean, they were people who believed in supernatural deities and such. More than likely, I don't know if I put too much in Pharaoh thinking that this is like the God, probably just like you mentioned, a God among gods. That this man has a God who has favor upon him. Therefore, this is the type of God we want to associate with. We want to have in a position of power. And what he does to elevate Joseph to a position of power. Number one, he clothed him. That's something that we've seen time and time again in Joseph's story, is the issue of clothing. And then he puts them in the chariots, and as they're going out, the servants are calling, "Make way," or "Kneel, bow the knee to this man." He is given a new name, given an Egyptian name, which this Egyptian name could mean a few different things. One being God speaks and he lives. He's also given a wife that's the daughter of a priest. So it's almost as if Joseph himself is being elevated to a position of some sort of priesthood within this land. He himself might be seen as a priest of sorts. He's given a name associating with God. He's now married into a religious family. But really all of this, whether it is the signet ring, the clothes, the gold chain, the new name, the new family, really what this is Joseph's naturalization as an Egyptian. He has, at this point, after everything that he's gone through, being brought from Canaan down into Potiphar's house, being accused of inappropriate behavior, being thrown into prison again, being forgotten, being in prison for 2 years, now having this ability to interpret this dream, he raised up to this position. He now is an Egyptian. By all accounts, he is an Egyptian at this point. And he begins now, in the beginning of verse 46, I believe, his life as an Egyptian. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout the land of Egypt, meaning that he probably went about establishing his role, letting people get to know him, seeing him as an authority figure now, setting in order the things he wants to be able to do in this position. And the text tells us, verse 47, during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvest. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it in the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea. That sounds familiar. That he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. Text tells us that two sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest at On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, and said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family." And the second son he named Ephraim. It said, "God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every land, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told Egypt, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." Now the famine had spread across the whole region. So Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. And that last verse is what segues us then into chapter 42, because part of that land that was affected would have been the land of Canaan, where Joseph's family resided. But now, as we look at this text, there are a few things here to us that probably stand out. One of those probably being what's said in verse 49 about such abundance like the sand of the seashore, but especially I think the names that Joseph gives to his sons. I think there's some significance there. What do you want to share with our audience about that significance?
All of these verses here is very Egypt centered. Joseph is being raised up. He's shaved off his beard, which would have been probably one of the biggest signs that he's not an Egyptian. They typically were clean shaven, whereas the Semitic types or the Canaanites, people from that area of the world would have been more bearded. Go ahead.
They would have looked more like me and you.
Yes, we're you and me. Yes, we're very Semitic, the two of us. Like the opposite of that. But the idea, I think, here, especially with his naming of his sons, is he is forgetting about his father's house. I believe it's Manasseh. Let's see I have my note here. So Manasseh just means to forget. And then Ephraim is fruitful. So, and notice what's being fruitful. It's not God's people at this point that we're talking about. It's the grain in Egypt that are like the sand of the seashore. So all of this is just kind of a literary way of almost making us forget about what's really important. And that's really, I think that's a little bit happening with Joseph here. If you think about it, why does he want to forget about his father's house? It's been, we know it's been 13 years since he's been there. And in verse 46, he's 30 years old. He was 17 when he was sold into Egypt. So it's been 13 years, a long time, but not a huge amount of time. And now he's finally not a slave anymore. He is free to, what does the language say? He's free to go. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt in verse 45. Joseph can go anywhere he wants in the land of Egypt. And yet he never takes a little trip, 100, 200 miles, a couple weeks trip to go up and visit his family. That just seems odd, except that he seems to have decided not to. And the naming of his children in this way shows us that he's wanting to almost forget that part of his life. And I think, we talk about Joseph definitely as a positive character for the most part. He's a very godly character, and he does what's right most of the time. I think this is going to be his biggest failure, and maybe why he's not the son that the seed promise goes through. And it's because it's like he rejects it at this point. He doesn't want to have anything to do with his family in this instance. He's fine having the signet ring of Pharaoh as opposed to the signet ring of Judah that we read about. Of course, Judah gives that to a prostitute, but he seems to have a come to Jesus moment, if you will, and has a turnaround in his narrative. Well, I think we're seeing both a high point and almost a low point here with Joseph, just reminding us that he's forgetting about his family. And I think that's why we have several chapters to go with his brothers. I think that's part of the reason for all of the deception and the tricks and the tests and things that they go through. He's wanting, he had forgotten about that. He had put that behind him. He was moving forward in a different direction, and he's needing to be course corrected a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying there with the family, just the names. Who was it? I think it's Jared Saltz in one of his articles. He puts these names, the understanding of these names into slightly different terms. First one, Manasseh, forget home, is the way he describes it. The name Ephraim, I laugh every time I read it. He says, instead of God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction, he says, I like it better here anyways. There is some remembrance of God. Throughout this entire section, God has been focused on by Joseph. So it isn't that he's forgotten God. That's not the issue. It's just the fact that he feels, maybe he feels betrayed by his family. It's hard to to really read too much into the psyche of Joseph just because it's not displayed to us. But think of it from his perspective. He's the favorite son of his father. All right. He's been thrown in a ditch and sold. Could it be in his mind he's thinking, my dad's pretty wealthy. He's a strong and powerful man. He should know where I'm at, and why has he not come and gotten me? Could that be part of Joseph's issue? Maybe he's thinking that his dad has just abandoned him, that his dad has moved on from him. The thing is, he doesn't know that his brothers have taken his cloak, dipped them in goat's blood, and presented them to their father as if he's been killed. He doesn't know that at all. At least that seems to be, again, reading into it a little bit, if I'm allowed a little bit of that license, that seems to be where he's at. He just feels like he's been abandoned. And in his mind, if my father's house has abandoned me, then you know what? God hasn't. God hasn't abandoned me. He's brought me to this place, and he's helped me be fruitful. He's just going to embrace where he is, rely upon God, and whatever for his family, whatever come what may. Which, what's going to come here in chapter 42 is that very family, the brothers that sold him off into slave, and that sold him to the Ishmaelites, that sent him down to Egypt. Again, they're going to be a part of this land that is within this famine, that's been affected by this famine. They're going to hear about Egypt having grain. They're going to come down to Egypt, and they're going to have a reunion unbeknownst to them with their brother who they had sold. Yeah, Alan, this is tough. I feel for Joseph in a sense. I feel for him in a sense, and I kind of see him as being fortunate as well. It stinks to be sold off by your brothers, to be sent off from your land, to not have your dad come to get you. But at the same time, I mean, there are people who have found themselves in worse positions when something bad has happened. But yeah, tough stuff here from Joseph. Yet God is with him. God is faithful. And God has a plan. He knows what that's the thing with these chapters. God knows what he's doing. God knows how to get Joseph to the place he needs to be in order for the family to be preserved. I'm just so impressed by God and his incredible wisdom in knowing exactly what needs to happen in order for that plan to continue on and for that story to continue to be written in the way that he written. Alan, what closing comments do you have on this study, this text that we've looked at this afternoon? Good stuff from you. Always appreciate what you do for us.
I think we mentioned a little bit last time, but I want to kind of highlight at the end just some of the parallels that Joseph has with other characters of the Bible. I think with Joseph's rise to power and then the things that he does, that Pharaoh does to honor him, it's a lot of the same language that we see with Mordecai in the book of Esther. So obviously this book came first, so it would be good to go back and read Esther and read those passages, and you couldn't help but hear, you're reading Esther for the first time. Well, you're clearly hearing the same type of thing with Joseph as well. So there would have been some parallels there. And then, of course, with Jesus, we've mentioned Joseph is a very, very clear type of Christ. And all of this, the point of all of this story is to show how God's people went down to Egypt. And then, later on in the book of Exodus, that's probably the focal point of all of these, is how the children of Israel came to be in Egypt so that they could be delivered out of it. This is just the part that shows us the why. Well, I just remember that it was, Christ followed that same path. You remember when he was just a young boy, his parents had to flee down to Egypt to avoid the wrath of the king Herod. So there was the same thing is going to happen over these next couple passages. God's people fleeing down to Egypt for a time, but then then they will be brought out of Egypt, and Jesus follows that same path, and eventually he's going to be at the same age. 30 years old. Joseph is elevated to number 2 in the nation of Egypt. It's about the same age. That's when Jesus begins his ministry and his elevation to the right hand of God. So I think we're supposed to, when we see Jesus, we're supposed to see those parallels with Joseph, and how Joseph, it's through Joseph really that the whole family is saved in a sense. And it's through Jesus that not just the, God's people, but the whole world can be saved, but specifically his people that, part of God's family, the family of, the family of Abraham, if you will, the descendants, the children of faith. So there's just wonderful to read this, thinking about what happens later on with Jesus, and seeing all those play out throughout the Bible.
Absolutely. And that's the benefit that we really get from taking time to walk through the scriptures, and specifically the narrative, like we're doing in this study, to simply walk through the text and to not just breeze through it, but to really look at it, examine it, to make connections from the text that we've already read up to this point. And then having prior knowledge of scripture, we're able to make connections with what's going to come later on. Yeah, so beneficial to see this and to be encouraged by God's faithfulness and the fact that he is always working to accomplish his purposes, and that he uses people, he uses us to do so, even people who are flawed, like Joseph. He wasn't a perfect man. He wasn't even here in the beginning, as our friend Jared says, but he certainly does he does develop into one as the story progresses. Alan, thank you so much, as always, for your great insights and for your teaching us so many of the great details that are found here within this text. I hope that our audience, those who have joined us today, we've had a good number today, have been encouraged by this look through the text. And if you have any questions about this text, you have any questions about any other spiritual issues, if you have any spiritual questions, please feel free to drop those in the inbox here on the Pleasant Plains page. And if you're here in Jackson, if you have any needs that we could try to assist you with, please feel free to reach out. So if you're looking for a place to worship on Sunday morning, we'll be worshiping together in person Sunday morning, 10 a.m. at our church house. For those who are able to, we are going to be meeting at, like I said, at 10 a.m. for a period of worship, be preaching from Mark chapter 5 and verses 1 through 20, where the incredible Jesus, the great servant, where he goes up against a demonic legion. I'm looking forward to studying that text with the church here and those who will be able to tune in with us. Thank you all so much for everything that you do in participating with us, for the great comments and the encouragements. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Hope you are able to get out and enjoy this beautiful Friday. It is truly a beautiful day that God's blessed us with. His glory is seen all around us. His incredible nature, his divine attributes are seen. Hope you get out and enjoy it just a little bit. God bless you, though. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Everybody take care.
Take care.